glad you're foregoing your lunch and spending it with me. Your growling stomachs will probably give you a signal to leave. So I'm actually here in Washington because my nephew graduated from Catholic University in America. And his mom, my younger sister, is not a tiger mom, she's a bulldozer mom. So we were very proud when he received the President's Award and Phi Beta Kappa and 4 honor societies and was the commencement speaker. So like we're up to here with it. We're glad they're gone. I want to tell you a little bit about how this book came about. And actually I was speaking with someone earlier and I said, you know, in a way, the Department of Labor's induction of the Chinese workers was a catalyst for this. This is probably the most iconic photograph of the 19th century. You probably recognize it. It's the champagne photo at Promontory Summit, taken May 10th, 1869. And it's the ceremonial coming together of the Union Pacific and Central Pacific Railroads. And some folks say, well, you know, who's not in the photo? There's one Chinese person in the photo that we can recognize, and that's this fellow who's got his back turned to the camera. But in fact, if you read about that event, there are no workers in the photo at all. You know, these were people who happened to be crossing the Promontory Summit and heard about the event and are tourists and onlookers. Because the Central Pacific had finished its work, was waiting for the Union Pacific to show up to do this ceremony. And the Union Pacific had been delayed because they had not paid their workers. So about 15, 20 miles toward Omaha, their train filled with their luminaries were delayed because they wanted to be paid. So they were delayed by a couple of days. So the workers on both sides, Union Pacific and Central Pacific, were not milling around Promontory waiting for this ceremony. So the photo, we use the photo for whatever nefarious purposes we want to use. So it's been a photograph that the Asian American community has used to say we've been left out, we deserve to have been recognized. Absolutely, we deserve to have been recognized. But as historians, we, you know, appreciate more of the contextual information about the photograph. But it is the most iconic photo, and everybody uses it, and there are no Chinese in it, but one. So Chinese did work on the railroad. They worked on the Central Pacific, as you know, and the Central Pacific began in Sacramento. The Central Pacific had a huge labor problem in 1864. They could not find workers. They wanted Irish workers, they would hire crews, and then once they got paid, the Irish workers would disappear because there was easier work elsewhere. The railroad, the building of a railroad was hard work. So the Central Pacific said, what are we gonna do? We've built hardly any track. We've constructed maybe 30 miles in a year, 18 months, whatever. What are we gonna do? So there were Chinese workers in the area. Chinese laborers were used in road work. They helped build the Dutch Flat Wagon Road, which was the only way to cross the Sierras at that time. It follows the path of the railroad. So one of the Crockers said, let's try Chinese workers. And James Strobridge, who was the foreman, said, hell no, I ain't gonna boss any Chinese. Right, the Chinese are small in stature, they're too little, they're not gonna be able to handle this tough railroad work. So finally, we're desperate, let's try a small group. We will hire 50 workers, give them a trial for a month and see how they work out. Well, they hired 50 workers, and sure enough, they worked out. They did the heavy lifting. They graded the road beds, they carried rocks, they put rocks on wagons so they could pull, you know, take them to be dumped. And thought, oh, gee, maybe these workers are going to work out anyway. After all, let's hire more. So the Central Pacific began systematically to hire Chinese workers. And by Stanford University's estimate, as many as 20,000 Chinese ended up working on the Central Pacific. Of course, the Central Pacific had a huge challenge building the railroad. They had the toughest terrain. They had to build tunnels through the Sierra Nevada. And they ended up building 15 tunnels through the granite of the Sierras. No power tools. They used black powder and they used hand tools. And this is an image of Summit Tunnel, which is the equivalent in length of 5 football fields. It's about 26 feet tall, and they were making inches of progress every day. So the way the railroad was set up is a competition between the Union Pacific and the Central Pacific. So whichever company laid the most track made the most money. The Union Pacific had it easy. They were coming through the plains. It's flat. That's why you had hell on wheels. They had to do something after all that hard work every day. The Sierra Nevada was another story. So the Central Pacific had teams on both ends of this particular tunnel, the Summit, which Ted wants to turn into a national landmark. They had teams of workers at both ends, east and west end, and they started at the top. They drilled through the top, and as they made progress to build this thing through the center, they had teams working on both faces internally. So they were working 4 faces at once, 24 hours a day to build this Summit Tunnel. So the Chinese did some amazing work. So fast forward 50 years ago, the Chinese had really never been acknowledged for their contributions to building the railroad. If you studied history or went to social studies or whatever, you would be lucky to hear a paragraph about how the Chinese worked on the railroad, but you really didn't know what they did. You didn't hear about the Summit Tunnel. You may have heard about, 10 miles in one day. So 50 years ago, the Historical Society said, we are going to take this opportunity at 100 years old, 100th anniversary, to commemorate the Chinese. So the community came together and had two commemorative plaques made, one to be installed at Sacramento at the terminus, one to be installed at Promontory where the 2 railroads met. The head of the Historical Society, Phil Troy, was invited to speak at the ceremony on May 10th in 1969. Unfortunately, things didn't work out. He ended up getting pushed off the program, and instead, he heard the Secretary of Transportation give kind of a backhanded compliment to the workers of the Central Pacific. And he said, John Volpe said, who else but Americans could drill 10 tunnels? Who else but Americans could chisel through miles of solid granite? Who else but Americans could have laid 10 miles of track? And of course, as students of Chinese American history, we know those laborers were not Americans. They were prohibited from becoming Americans. They were subjected to all kinds of discrimination. And so the Chinese Historical Society felt that we were slighted, and the story hit the press, and it's kind of was a sore in our collective psyche for 50 years because we wanted Chinese workers to be acknowledged. And the DOL did that in 2014. So it was the first time a government entity acknowledged Chinese workers. It took 145 years for that to happen, and it happened here, and I was here, and we had descendants here, and we had a descendant speaker on the program with Secretary Perez. And some of us in the audience was there as well, and I have to tell you, it was very, very moving. Brought tears to people's eyes that finally Chinese workers been acknowledged. I skipped over these, that sore that festered in our collective psyche. Professor Gordon Chang of Stanford is a 4th generation California Chinese, and he remembered stories from his family. And he's, you know, Stanford University wouldn't exist without Chinese workers. We need to do something at Stanford to acknowledge them. So he launched a research project in 2012. He thought he would, it would take 3 years. It turned out to be a 7.5-year project. So just this May, this month, 3 publications were released by Stanford. So we now don't have to look for random paragraphs in, you know, the shelf load of books on the railroad to read about Chinese or to piece them together or to figure them out. We have 3 volumes that we can now go to that are all about the Chinese experience on the railroad. I spoke earlier about this photograph. Corky Lee, who's a photographer in New York, started doing this flash mob event at Promontory every year to get Chinese into that photo. And that's been happening since 2012 as well. These are the descendants who were on stage in 2014 right here. And I thought I should be there, but I'm a wannabe descendant, so I wasn't in the photo. They're always talk about nameless, faceless Chinese. So this is actually a Union Pacific photographer who took this and sold this as a postcard. And these are allegedly the 8 men who helped lay the last rail at Promontory. They don't look puny to me. They're tall, they're young, they're virile, but they're nameless. And then in 1919, at the 50th anniversary, the Southern Pacific Bulletin published this photograph of 3 workers, and they're named Wang Fuk, Li Shao, Hu Ging, and they're described as 3 members of gang who laid the last tie at Promontory in 1869. And they were described in newspapers in 1919 as being over 90 years old. Once we found that photo, we really wanted to find out who these guys were, and we have so far we haven't had any luck in tracking them down. But then with the DOL as the catalyst and the descendants coming to the ceremony, descendant families started coming forward. So in these descendant families, they have shared stories over the years about their great-great-grandfathers. So Jean Chan, who grew up in Cortland and Locke, California, was researching a military ancestor and had a meeting at the Railroad Museum in Sacramento. And so one of the staff at the Railroad Museum asked Jean, do you have a railroad background? And Jean said, oh yeah, you know, I think my great-grandfather worked for the railroad, but we don't know very much. So the staffer asked Jean what that name was, and he said, oh, he was named Zhao Qi, or maybe Jim King. By the time Jean finished his meeting about his military ancestor, the staffer came up and said, here's the name Jim King on the payroll. So Jean became the first descendant to have identified, serendipitously, his ancestor's name on a payroll record. So this is his payroll. He's Jim King Company. And some of you may know that on the payroll records in the Central Pacific, most Chinese names are somebody. So it's Ted, or John, or somebody. It's a diminutive, it's not the full name. And that's partially because of the way Chinese were hired by the railroad. They were hired in gangs of 30, in groups, but they were called gangs. And they were led by a foreman or a head man. And the head man was another Chinese. The head men were the Ahs. They were the Lems, Chucks, Wongs. Their names are on the payroll. Or they were like Jim King, so Co could be contractor, or Co could be company, who helped hire the gangs for the railroad work. So that's Jim King. Jim King is one of the stories in the Voices of the Railroad book. This fellow, he looks kind of ghostly. So his name is Lum Ah Chu. His great-great-granddaughter has been doing research on him. He too settled in Cortland and became a farmer. This photograph is from one of the, I'm sure you have ancestral photos at home. And they're in those old 19th century frames with the curved glass, right? So he's in there and the family does not want to take him out of the frame to get a better visual of him. So he looks kind of ghostly, but he was a cook. So cooks and kind of these non-laborer positions were sometimes named in the payroll. His name is found on the payroll as Achu, cook, with the number of man hours he worked. Not only that, but he's on the payroll of the Summit Tunnel. So she can place him at a time, a specific time in a specific place. So that was number 2. These are 3 other workers. Chinlin Su's descendants were at the DOL, were here 5 years ago. And he settled in Denver, and the family is extremely proud of what he did in Denver, and he's been recognized as a community, not as a Chinese community leader, but as a community leader in Denver. This fellow is Mok Chuck. He settled in LA. He ended up leaving the Central Pacific and working for the Southern Pacific till the 1880s. And that family has very proud memories of his work with the Southern Pacific. He retired from the Southern Pacific and was given one of those ceremonial gold watches. It's a Tizot, engraved with his name. You know, and that's a treasured heirloom. This fellow is Moy Jin Mun. It's a later photo. He actually didn't work. Oops, sorry. He didn't work for the Central Pacific. He worked for Leland Stanford. He started out as a garden boy on the Stanford estate in Sacramento for the duration of the building of the Central Pacific. And his family has all kinds of artifacts that they have yet to identify, catalog, and explain. They just have boxes. So Moy Jin Mun was one of 3 brothers that, sorry, my fingers are dyslexic. There are 3 brothers. Scott Seligman wrote a book about 3 tough Chinamen. He's one of the 3 tough Chinamen. So there's a Moy brother in San Francisco, who was Moy Jin Mun, a Moy brother in Chicago, and a Moy brother in New York. This fellow is Lim Lim Hong, who settled in San Francisco, outside of Chinatown. But what's extraordinary about his story is that there's visual proof that he worked on the Central Pacific, as well as the Lim contractor or Lim headman, because it could be any Lim, right? You could have 10 of you as Lims, and there'd be an Lim, and he'd say, hey, that's my ancestor. Well, there's nobody to prove that it's not. But for him, I'm stuck, sorry. You'll have to buy the book. It's an image. Okay, this one. He is sitting here. This is Lim Lim Ong. This is believed to be a photograph of that group of first 50 Chinese who were hired at the Central Pacific Railroad to try out whether they can work on the railroad. So this is Lim Lim Ong. And that's him. He has very similar ears, right? Narrow face. And this is a family photo of Lim Lim Hong, his wife Chen Shi, and their 7 children in San Francisco in 1904. And if you look hard enough, it's the same face. It's got to be him. And on top of that, his family there's early documentation of his family in San Francisco. This is an Arnold Genthe photo. Arnold Genthe took very early photographs of Chinese in San Francisco, Chinatown. The Library of Congress has all of Arnold Genthe's collection of photos. This is Robert Lim, the 2nd son of Lim Lim Hong, and this is Lim Sing, who who's the oldest son of Lin Lepong. So all 7 of the Lin Lepong children have descendants who are busily recording, documenting their branch of the family. So it just gives me chills. And actually, Lin Lepong's great-granddaughter was here at the DOL in 2014, and I met her here. And she did a talk story with Ted. It just gives me chills. This is Hung Lai Wah and his 5 children and wife, also in San Francisco. But his story was that he and a brother worked on the railroad, and his brother had his eye blasted in a blasting accident as they were building the snow sheds up above Truckee. So that's the family story. And what's stunning about this story as well is that we have information about his wife, who's Tom Shi. She was sold into servitude by her family in China and arrived in San Francisco and ended up working for a very abusive Chinese family. And some of you may have heard about the missionary work of the Presbyterian mission, the Occidental mission in San Francisco. She was saved by the mission, rescued from her abusive family in San Francisco. She lived with them for 2 or 3 years. She refused to convert to Christianity, but she had met him on the streets of Chinatown and they fell in love. She wanted to marry him. Long story short, he wasn't a Christian. The mission said no. Well, she plotted to marry him. They married. And there is now a story on Amazon written by great-great-grandson Russell Lowe about their love story and how she escaped to marry him. That's her in this photograph by Thomas Houseworth. So this was a photograph that the Presbyterian Church, the Presbyterian Mission arranged with Thomas Houseworth. And this is, it's just stunning. We have this documentation by these photographers. And his book is called 3 Coins, and you can read about her journey on Amazon. So, 150 years later, we now are able to populate Chinese American history, early Chinese American history, with names and faces, and tie them to events that were integral, seminal to the development of the Chinese American community here. And part of that is because of the work of the DOL. Part of that is because, you know, we hold grudges close to our hearts, and so we don't let go. And we had to make that 1969 slight right by making sure that the Chinese laborers were acknowledged for their building of the Transcontinental. These are some of the a few of the descendants. And this was at Promontory 2 weeks ago. Spoke here in 2014 on that stage at the ceremony. She is a descendant on both sides of her family, railroad workers. So it was amazing to do this in front of 20,000 people at Promontory on May 10th. So we've kind of come full circle. But you know, the anniversary of the 150th, the coming together of the railroad, isn't really about spikes. It's not about the laying of the last rail. It's not about locomotives. It's really not even about the Summit Tunnel. Right? It's about immigrants. And it's about how we as immigrants have contributed to this country, the building of this country, and how we continue to do so. And so I'm just really pleased that I'm able to be here and to share the stories and to kind of put a stake in the kind of overall narrative of American history, say that we as Chinese Americans have a place.